This is where I think it's like, what's a beginner periodization model? And that would be sort of like just the reps with a linear basis, but mainly just get tons of reps with a minimal pool of exercises. So that would be level 1. I think level 2 is where most of our population on site and in peak strength lives. And that's where I think it's this to what you just laid out, where you're like, okay, you slowly build up intensity over time, and then you drop back down to high volume. And then you slowly build up intensity over time, and it's like undulating week to week or meso to meso with a linear buildup. So I want to cover this part and then get back into some of our stuff. And I realized after going over the periodization work is that it's way deeper, and I think I'm going to flip even further forward. We're going to have to go back and cover some of the sport depth stuff, but in real deep understanding. Now, I think I want to give you like 6 or 7 models of periodization and then talk through our model of periodization, compare it to theirs, and talk about the shortcomings of these other models. But I think ultimately understanding that the definition we could use for periodization would be manipulating all the variables of training so that an individual reaches peak performance at the most appropriate time. So manipulate all variables of training. The hard part with that is laying out what are the variables of training, how can we manipulate them, and how does the individual respond to those variables? Those are all open-ended, long-term, complex questions based off of the form of the athlete and how are we going to actually identify the form of the athlete. So now other terms. Macro cycle, so this would be basically like the entire year of a program. Mesocycle, 3 to 6 week period for us, 99 times out of 100, it's 4 weeks. Microcycle would be essentially each week. So the role for us is to figure out how to manage the training of athletes, specifically strength athletes, while also managing their fatigue to make the necessary adaptations and have improvements over time. Not just throwing random stuff at the wall, but helping to dial in the early days of training and I don't know why I have explanation there. I don't know what I was doing there. But some of the big goats that I wanted to bring down some of my books and stuff just to walk through this, because some of them I'm going to share with you like examples out of that. So some of the goats would be Medvedyev, Cherniak, Vorobyov, who I think is actually the one that no one actually knows about at all in the strength and conditioning world. People don't know who Vorobyov is. They don't know who he impacted. They don't know what he actually did. And I would say he is the #1 Russian leader of periodization alongside Bondarchuk. So, and then further into, I would say Verkhoshansky a little and Medvedyev, but Verkhoshansky I feel like used the other guys to build off of that. Taman, did you learn anything about periodization this weekend? Medvedyev. So mainly the big ones that you'll see would be like Medvedyev and Medvedyev and then Verkhoshansky. But I will say Vorobyov is like the absolute godfather of everything periodization that's Russian, and then Dr. B's is like the more sport-based periodization model. Okay, so I think the big thing here is actually understanding the principle of progressive overload. I think it's real simple to recognize that with periodization, we have to go ahead and see that progressive overload is a principle of gradually increasing stress of workouts on the system over time. So how can we make a workout, or how can we alter a variable through weight, through total volume, meaning reps, throughout a set, throughout a microcycle, and throughout a mesocycle, speed, rest period, tempo, distance, meaning full range, partial range, and this could even mean endurance work, and then training period, meaning is it a 1 hour session versus a 2 hour session versus a half-hour session. So weight would be, are we manipulating the actual load on the bar. Is it lighter? Is it heavier? And on top of that, are we adding any type of chains, bands, anything along those lines, hooks even? Volume again would just be, when are we determining the reps get measured? What level are they at when we determine that the reps need to get measured? What exercises are we measuring, and is there any type of multiplier like we've talked about in the past? Anything along those lines. Speed, so speed of the bar, VBT stuff. I think that's another great way that you can manipulate the stress of the workout. Rest period, how much time in between. That's going to force any specific type of adaptation. Think 1 minute rest, likely going to be more hypertrophy based work. 3 to 5 minute rest is going to be more strength work. Tempo would be slowing down the eccentric. Distance, again, partial range versus full range, and then the training period. Anybody have any questions about that with the progressive overload? I think this is really important to understand, just like the root of everything. Any questions?
I guess, are you going to get into more like if those are the variables, like what impacts the rate of change of those variables?
So my goal is that we're going to go through where periodization essentially started, who's used things in the popular sense that maybe we've been exposed to, and then what ours is relative to that, relative to the concept of progressive overload. So it's like, here starting off would be looking at linear system and reverse linear. When we went over in the past discussing this previously, we talked about how essentially there's no real, I don't believe there's any real importance to having periodization, and as long as someone's in level 1. Someone's a level 1 athlete, I don't think there's any real importance. I think that we tend to use the linear model in the gym here when someone is a level 1, meaning we do a lot of volume, a lot of reps, and they're just getting reps upon reps upon reps upon reps. And so I would argue if we would put a periodization model on something at that point in our system, it would be the linear system, which was initiated by Medvedyev. So he was at least in the Russian manuals, was the first person to really start to talk about that, especially with their weightlifting team. And so the other thing I want to bring up is that most of the periodization models are all related to weightlifting and track and field. I don't think I've ever seen a periodization model related to, there's one from a guy that we'll get into that would be football related or anything like that. Nothing is ever really clarified in this sense. And Medvedyev himself would say it's difficult to do these things outside of strength sports. But essentially, the linear system would be if you're looking in the CSCS book, you're looking at it goes hypertrophy, strength, power, peak, right? This is pretty standard what you're seeing in college and what you would be exposed to, as far as I can tell. You guys have anything? Any thoughts? So it'd be for us, I don't know if we would have someone do 10 to 12 sets or reps of clean, but we would do 4 sets of 4. If someone comes in and they're a new kid with just the bar, you do that for 3 to 5 weeks, then they're going to go reps of 6 to 8, let's say for back squat, and then they do that for 3 to 5 weeks, and then they go 3 reps or less. That's a really standard progression of the linear model. The reverse linear is essentially starting with really heavy load almost right away and doing it absolutely reverse. So you start with 3s, and then you try to hit these 3s for sets of 5. Now you try to hit those sets of 5 for sets of 8. Then you try to hit those sets of 8 for sets of 10 to 12. It's the reverse of the linear system. I actually think this is not a bad system if you're programming that regarding endurance training, but I don't think it's an effective system for resistance training. But this would be I would say this is where you can think about Medvedyev. Like this is, and you'll hear guys on podcasts who want to try to be smart and stuff, and they'll talk about Medvedyev or Medvedyev. It's just linear periodization, really. Any questions on that? This is the one I wanted to go into a little bit more, because I would say that it probably is the system that impacted me the most, more so than DJ.
Just real quick, so the reverse linear, don't we kind of do that if somebody comes in and tests first?
I would say, I don't know if I would say that we do it, because it would be an extended period. It would be like 4 weeks, I'd say. I do think the concept is good for establishing that baseline of where they're at. I think maybe it would be like a variable. I think that's the other thing too, is like there's so many variables of all this, but then the guys like never really go into the specific nuance around it. But yeah, I think that's a good question. Okay, so I train with Dr. B, which we'll get into Dr. B's system. I trained with Bondarchuk, and I had read Super Training. I had gone through, I had a decent understanding of what Poliquin was teaching with his model. But I also had a linear system that I was in college. And all of these systems tend to work. One thing too, I'll just throw out, Dr. B would say, all these things work as long as you have progressions laid in for how they can shift, how they can shift to from one system to another. This system, I randomly got this book. I don't even know where I found it, because there's a place in Michigan that publishes a lot of the Russian manuals, and this is not published by them. But this dude, Arkady Vorobyov, is like the first guy that I read his book, and I was like, oh my God, this is actually how we should program. And this is probably like 2008 to 2010. So basically, he found that if you would have an athlete do, let's say, a specific volume level, and then they would do that for 3 to 8 weeks, something like that, and then you just jump their volume very high, there would be a really quick response. And then if you did that for an extended period of time and drop their volume, there would be a really quick response. And those huge load jumps here were much more effective. And he believed that most of the work that an athlete should be able to do would be like 1/3 to 2/3 of their work they should be able to do when they're fresh. Like you walk in the gym and you can snatch 100 kilos pretty much all the time. I would say all of you guys can come in here. Now, you might need like a 5-minute warm-up, but you can, most of the work you should be able to come in and do pretty consistently without having a huge amount of preparation or excitement, right? Variable movements were also the mainstay of the Russian system, and it was all based off of Vorobyov. So we're doing different exercises, different movements that emulate competitive movements. And remember, this is all rooted in weightlifting, so they would be doing power snatches, low hang snatches, 1-box snatches, 2-box snatches. They were all variable movements, but they're still foundational as part of the load management. He believed in consistent patterns and sets. So 7 triples, all the same for all sets. So, and then a minimum amount of stimulus to maintain strength and freshen for compensation was the peaking model. So that was their, Vorobyov's peaking model was essentially drop the volume and then see what happens, and that's it. Does anybody have any questions about that? This was like late 60s into the 70s was when Vorobyov really started to like push this in the weightlifting world. He was part of Dave Riegert. He was part of, who was the real fat super heavyweight? He was part of coaching him as well. Any questions? You know what I'm talking about? Super fat, super heavyweight. God, I can't. Yeah.
You got that at 10 to 600?
No, from back in the day in like the 70s, he won everything all the time. He's like a 10-time world champ. And that was the other thing with this system is that.
They don't juice?
Yeah, for sure. So when they were on stuff, they would not go on it until they got within, from my understanding from talking to Dr. B, they would go on it either for a specific year and then go off for a full year, or they would go on it within like 10 to 12 weeks of a competition. And they had, D-ball is called like meton or metondion or something like that in Russian. And that's what they were really just taking then. But the big thing with the Russian system, and R.A. Roman talks about this, he's another Russian weightlifting coach, is that the Bulgarians were notorious for having athletes come up and win a world title when they were 17, 18, 19 years old and then fall off. The Russians were notorious for having guys be around for 10 years. Yuri Vardanian was relevant for literally like 9 to 10 years. And that's like the mainstay with this system is the variable exercises, stability and consistent technique, and then the drug usage was not as prevalent. Obviously still prevalent, but not as prevalent.
So, just the variation is what helped them not burn out, basically. They were the ones that discovered that, and that's the big distinction.
I think the variations and the fact that a lot of the work, at least 1/3 of the work, was like stuff that you can do pretty easily, and some bodybuilding work. Like that's the other thing is like that's all part of Vorobyev's system is like making sure that you're doing movements, and they would still obviously go to max on certain exercises, but it wouldn't be more than 15% of their training. Most of their training was based around, and if you ever read Zatsiorsky's book, his model, I think he contributes to Medvedyev, but it's really Vorobyev is who started the whole system. I actually think a lot of Vorobyev's work was stolen by Louis Simmons. I can't entirely prove that, but he's so like not popular, and so much of it is so similar to like the conjugate system that it's like, I don't know. I think that's like one of my conspiracies in the strength world. Okay, the Medvedyev system. You say it?
Louis Simmons. I know he died.
You didn't know he passed away?
When he died?
Last year. So the Medvedyev system would be weightlifting, learning the classic lifts consistently for 2 years. So it's like, I would relate that to like the classic linear model, like just get reps and reps and reps and reps and reps on. Then every 2 years there would be a large shift in training. GPP was anywhere from 20 to 40% of total training. Again, I think this is still a lot more of a linear type system. Medvedyev worked with Prilipin. So if you've ever seen Prilipin's chart, which is the chart that like if you have 8 reps, do this percentage of your max for 8 reps. Prilipin was his junior coach essentially. Medvedyev was the head guy, Prilipin was under him. And a lot of the variation-based work came out of this camp from Vorobyev. So a lot of people will also contribute because Medvedyev was after Medvedyev as far as the coaching was concerned. A lot of it still stemmed from Vorobyev. Variable movements are still effectively used to raise the classic lifts. And so the hard part with all this is like thinking through how can we relate this to soccer or football or basketball. But this is like still learning, like this is early 60s, 70s into the 80s. Does everybody know Prilipin's chart? I feel like that's one of the charts they use in the book. I always think it's funny because they pull from Russian research, but then, I don't know, in those books, but then they ignore some of the other stuff that they say. Okay, the block method periodization. Block method, to me, is probably one of the next more popular methods used outside of linear periodization. And if you're a fan of Cal Strength, when they were coming up, Cal Strength was like essentially like the biggest proponent of block periodization, at least in the US early on. They would have their, accumulation, realization, transmutation is sort of the mesocycles. I think I actually forgot to put that in there. But the macrocycles would be set up where it would be, let's say, 16 weeks of an off season, a preseason, an in-season, and a postseason. Then each mesocycle would be accumulation, realization, or accumulation, transmutation, realization. And then the microcycles would be broken up in here where they would go 1 to 2 weeks they'd have a prep period, they'd have a competitive period, then they'd have a transition to the next block. So you're establishing the block as like essentially one clear-cut defined goal. I want to increase my back squat during this 12 weeks. I think block method is great for that reason, but it's usually based around one specific goal, and I think there's a lot of evidence that we can do things concurrently. So that's like the one downfall here with the block method. Vladimir Surin, this is one method, so the block method is one method that he's used with triathletes, marathoners, a lot of swimmers as well. Dr. B initially was like a huge proponent of the block method, or I think maybe block method is like the foundation of his method early on in the late 70s into the 80s. And Asurin he's still pretty relevant in the endurance field as well, and he's even mentioned how Dr. B basically contributed to this ideology. And then the goal is to provide a high concentration of sport-specific exercise and avoid conflicting responses of non-compatible training workloads. So sport specificity, don't interrupt what someone's doing in their sport with what we're doing in the gym, which is reasonable. Is this clear, this one?
That last part that you said, that was developed in the block method. Basically, that's the whole premise.
Yeah, it's like,
let's not mess with the sport.
Yeah.
Because they're talking about sports other than weightlifting now.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Like track and field,
Yeah.
swimming, okay.
Yeah, yes.
We can't be like maxing out.
Yeah. Let's try to increase this kid's back squat for the next 8 weeks, and ideally he improves his start on the track. So let's make sure that we're communicating together. We're only going to be focusing on his back squat to increase his starting position in 100 meters, and we need to make sure that we're both on the same wavelength.
Okay, interesting.
So
it expanded from, this is where like weightlifting, and then now it's like, okay, we're applying it to other sports.
yeah, yeah. And I would argue, like, the other areas that the Russians were using a lot of the weightlifting models were in the jumps. Like high jump, vault, they were dominating those jumps for a while because they were using like the weightlifting models to push that, and then into the late 70s into the 80s, block method as well, like shifting over for the sports. So it's like thinking like, okay, there's the strength sports here. Now this starts to arise out of this is the block method, and then you start to see other methods. This is essentially, I would argue, even what most swimming uses now with their management of training.
Would you say it's a downfall? Again?
Not having a concurrent system. Like I think you can argue, like there's a lot of evidence that you could say, I want to increase someone's start and increase their turnover at the same time. You don't have to just focus on one specific thing. And especially, like, I just think the dynamic aspect of recognizing that you can do more than one, you can have more than one adaptation is okay in training. Within a very, you're not going to get somebody to increase their max back squat and PR their marathon. But you're probably going to get somebody to increase their back squat and have a faster turnover if they're doing the training accordingly. Now, the PR might not be as large, but they're still going to improve those qualities. And so for me, a lot of this too comes back to understanding the exercise umbrellas, okay? So for what we talked about last week, and then thinking through what movements, what adaptation are we looking for, let's say with the start? Okay, they've got to be stronger and they've got to be able to move fast, to rapidly develop a massive amount of force if we want to increase their start. What exercises on what day of your split improve those specifically? And that's where I think identifying the adaptations we're looking for is key. Okay, so the complex method, this would be Dr. B's. This would be classic Dr. B method of periodization, essentially a repetitive system of training. So there's little to no change at all throughout the entire period of training. This is going to be like entirely, so when people say like functional or sports specific, they're not truly thinking through the lens of sports specificity, at least in my opinion. This is sports specific. This is essentially everything that you're doing in the weight room is all geared towards 100% what you're doing with the sport. Do I think that that means it's the best? Like, no, but an example of what this is you would take your throws, you know, for a training session, you'd take, let's say 30 throws, you'd come into the gym and you do the exact same lift every single day. Every day you do, you know, let's say a close grip snatch or a power snatch, and then a glute ham, and then a back squat, and then a pad bench, and then jump lunges, and then, you know, I don't know, a step up, whatever. And then you come back and you do the exact same lift in the afternoon. And then you come tomorrow morning and you do the same lift. And then you come in the afternoon and you do the same thing. So you're doing the intensity, the volume doesn't ever change. The movements are the only thing that change, and they only change after each block. Sometimes you might have lift 1, lift 2, and then the next day you're doing the same lift 1 and the same lift 2. So the only change, the only variable that happens is the exercise over time. The issue I have with this, so there's like developmental stages. So this stage is going to set me up for this, and it's laid out that way with Dr. B. Is like he would say, okay, this is special preparatory phase, special developmental phase. So we're using those exercise qualities that we talked about, SDs and SPs. And then this is when we're going to be peaking, and everything would be based around how many sessions you would have in each phase. So special prep versus developmental to get to that or you know, even general prep to special developmental to get to the peak. And then it would be, okay, we need, you know, I don't know, 100 sessions to get to this peak. We need 60 sessions of this and 70 sessions of that to get to a peak. And it was really based off of how your body was reacting from previous programs, just based off your measurements in the actual throws. So sometimes, from my experience, from what I saw, was people would be like, oh, well, I'm 3 sessions off. I'm not going to throw far at this meet because I need to get 3 more sessions. Or I missed my peak. I'm at session 30 and I was supposed to peak at session 25. And my meet's at session 30. I'm screwed. That's a downfall. I also think it's like taking things that are more abstract and putting like a very precise measurable on it, and I don't think that it's like pretending you're in an entire vacuum. I think the sessions stuff is cool, but I also think it's a little voodoo-ish. Does anybody have any questions on this?
What's the point?
The point is everything you're doing is based off of improving the circle. You get your strength levels to a certain point, and you have to do the exact same thing every day so that when you go to throw, you know the feeling that you're going to have every single day. There's never a day that you feel like really, really good or really crappy. You're always just sort of blah. And then once in a while, you start to feel really good. It's absolutely horrible. Like, meaning the training is really, really strenuous and really mind-numbing. You're just coming in and you're just doing work upon work upon work. Every single session is identical. 0 changes. For literally, you might do this for like 8 weeks. The same thing every morning, every afternoon, 8 straight weeks. No change.
Sounds lazy. I'm not saying like I get it, like no.
It's sort of like the trash man analogy. It's like, well, what's a trash guy do? He's not worried about his volume. He's just going to go and throw his trash in the back of a truck. And he does the same thing every single day. And it's like, if you just keep putting more and more and more and more and more, all of a sudden there's going to be an adaptation. And you're going to blow up. And you're going to have a reaction, and it's going to be this huge result. I think the downfall is it's absolutely mentally grueling. Like, you will mentally die. 0 questions asked. And on top of that, it's just, dude, you're not going to make any money as a business doing this.
Seems like it's not flexible either.
No, yeah, I mean, it's not. It's like, and like, dude, don't get me wrong. When Dr. B would hand you a napkin with like little pictograms on it in a workout, it'd be cool. Like, you just got a workout from Dr. B and it's got stick figures and then 2x15, 2x5, and it has all the things. He would literally hand you a paper towel or a napkin and be like, okay, here's your workout for the next 6 weeks. And then you'd go do it. So it's like a neat thing, but you couldn't change it. And if he saw you even doing, so like a good example would be, to go to Trevor's point, we had a session where we were throwing shots for height into a wall. So there's a wall in Kamloops that has like sort of markers on it. And we were throwing 12-pound shots for height. Jesse and I were. And Dr. B was down with all the hammer guys, and we're throwing this for height. It's 4 sets of 15, and you do 4 sets of 15 in the morning, 4 sets of 15 in the afternoon. And we're going all of a sudden Jesse's like, let's go 2 sets where you and I try and see who can hit the line, almost like a range, the exact line the most. And then we tried to raise it to see who could go up even higher. So we're screaming and like yelling, like trying to hit this. And Dr. B comes up and he just starts losing his mind. Like, you don't get it, you're ruining it, you're now just set yourself back for a couple of weeks because you're making this a competitive thing, and this is what you're doing because you don't understand how hard, how important this aspect is. So you raise the intensity too much, and now we screwed it up. Yeah, exactly. So that, to Trevor's point, it's not flexible, and it's not fun. Clearly, I would assume this is what Katzberg is doing right now. And so, like, honestly, like, someone like him who does seem to be a very level-headed, throw every single day, do the simple lifts, go home, take a nap, throw again, do the simple lifts, go home, go to bed. That's like what you do every day. It can be really successful, and I think it's very successful in the hammer, and if you don't have a job, but I don't think it's something that you can really use to develop a whole gym off of or anything along those lines. Now, the thing that I would say that I've pulled from this is the value of a lot of reps, the value of consistent reps, and I think maybe, just monitoring measurements.
Would you say that like the special development, basically like the sports specific, instead of doing it all the time, you've taken them and
Yeah.
like the peak stages when to do that.
Yeah.
But not all the time.
Yeah, and I would say so use the examples of when we were throwing for height. So that would be one version of like a sports-specific exercise that then transferred into like a shuffle throw, which then transferred into a dumbbell half turn. So like that, or like standing discus throws, I always thought were really good. It's like side med ball throws. I think taking those exercises and seeing that they are effective, like the shot swing, taking movements out of it, I think is good for us, but Taman doesn't even think any of that's valuable.
There was time and place.
You ruined it. You would not last in Russia.
Oh, I would have been done for it. They would have put me on a stake up there.
So, even along those lines, like when I was up there, Dylan went down to Mexico and drank and partied and stuff. And when he came back, Dr. B just screamed at him and basically told him he had ruined training. Then Dylan wanted to bench 500 pounds because he felt weak. And Dr. B was like, no, you're not going to bench 500 pounds. And then he let him bench 500 pounds, and Dylan threw bad for like 8 weeks. And he said it was all because he wanted to bench 500 pounds, and he got slow. So it's like he's just... Any interruption to the pattern that he was trying to establish, like any interruption was not effective. And from my understanding, I think that's what Rhodey does. I'm not positive. I know Trevor.
He did for a period of time.
Yeah, I don't know what he does now.
He did for a period.
I asked him his elevator pitch for this. I said, can you give me an elevator pitch for the complex method outside of this? And he texted me back and he said, I had to Google what elevator pitch was. And I was like, oh, come on, how do you not know what this is? And he's like, I don't know, you're the one with all the Olympians. I'm like, can you just give me an elevator pitch for what complex method means? He said,
That's, you were doing 2 sessions, same shit, twice a day.
yeah.
How are you getting, are you actually lifting hard or are you lifting like,
No, everything's like 60 to 80%.
then how the hell did Dylan get so damn big?
Because Dylan trained in a system prior to that where he was lifting as heavy as possible. So he trained with Derek Evely. Now, Evely is a proponent of complex now. And he's done his versions of that complex. He's done his own thing. But before he met Dr. B, everything was like, he had him hang clean, sets of 4, 200 kilos, back squatting 500 plus pounds. There's a video of Dylan that Dylan had of him squatting 315 for 15 on a Bosu ball. He was doing that type of stuff. Like, he was essentially doing like shock training, stuff that you see like Adam Archuleta's making a comeback now. Like, that's what they were doing. And he was lifting heavy. So like, people's argument at the time was, no one can do this unless there's someone like Dylan Armstrong, who's already at that level for shot. I don't know, maybe they're right to a point. I don't know. I think for hammer it works really well. I don't think it's as effective in the shot. I also don't think it's effective for other sports. Like this is going back a decade where Justin was like, imagine having a whole team of football players that you could start them based off of their sessions to a peak, and you could pull guys out and put this guy in because he's gonna feel better today than the other guy. And it's like, that's not reality. That's not how things work. So it's a cool idea, but it's a cool thought experiment. Now, going into, I put here, butcher periodization, I mean Bulgarian. Okay, so that's my funny thing for the day. Classic lifts, snatch, clean, jerks, back squat, front squat, almost 0 pulls. This is from Medvedyev. Okay, so very, very high frequency of big lifts, high intensity, 2 to 3 sessions every single day. Basically, you're worked to death and you rip cigarettes to make sure that you feel better, and a lot of caffeine and a lot of drugs. Now, the interesting part here is that you can see, Greece essentially, like Pyros grew up in a Russian system that was then converted to a Bulgarian system, essentially. So it's like, how high can I back squat? How heavy can I front squat? And then that's going to push my competitive lifts. Okay, so in my thought process for us in a scenario of throwing, it would be throw to a PR or as hard as possible every single day, then come in power snatch and back squat every single day, or bench every other day, something like that. And we would do that until you guys hit a PR or break, essentially. For football players, I would think it would be something similar, like, okay, we're gonna run sprints 3 days a week as hard as possible. We're gonna squat as heavy as possible and bench as heavy as possible. And then we're gonna practice later on, and that's gonna be the system for development. So this is, and again, this goes back to entirely based around weightlifting.
So was this system in response to Bulgaria getting just smacked around by Russia in weightlifting?
So I don't know the history entirely. I know Medvedyev came up, I want to say in like the 60s or 70s, and then that's when he was like, all right, this is what we're gonna do. I know some of it is also related back to Dr. B used to speak very negatively of him, like saying he was basically just a total dope, and that this is what he had to do because he was not intelligent enough to create like an actual variable system. Like he literally was like, he's the dumbest person I've ever met. Like,
Seems like it's just like, you know what? We're gonna lift heavier and more.
yeah. I mean, I've
Like,
So I've read and watched videos where they're like, he would have intense talks before every single session. Like, and the other thing is my brother had a guy from Bulgaria who worked for him, okay, and he grew up as a Greco-Roman wrestler. They had specific schools, okay, and actually one of Lincoln's friends' parents, their parents were in the gymnastics school before everything like sort of collapsed. And you would come up and they would say like, okay, you're either going to a technical school or you're going to the sports school. And if you go to the sports school, you just go ham as hard as possible to try and essentially promote, also think about the political stance at this time. Like, it was a communist country at the time. They're trying to also prove to the rest of the world that even though they're smaller, they have, they have this power and strength and the weightlifting aspect was like a better life than working out in the fields and struggling.
A little better.
Yeah, a little better maybe.
Does anyone use this to its fullest extent, like today, like outside of weightlifting?
So John Bros, which I don't even know if his gym's still around, but I know he would follow this. Now, he had 2 athletes get popped for it. And he used to say, so this is where they would talk about, I think I talked about this last week, like if you had to back squat a certain weight or you had to clean a certain weight on a timeline 12 weeks from now and someone was holding a gun to your head, what are you going to do? Not back squat every day? You're going to do it constantly to try and make that adaptation. Now, I'm not saying that that's a great way to look at it. My understanding was that Bros was the only one who truly used it. I think there's times that this is really effective. Like, I think there's points where you can go 4 weeks and be like, all right, we're going to max out Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And it's like, and I think there's stages where athletes are struggling with heavy weight and you can push it. But it might only last 3 to 6 weeks, even maybe in their entire career. Now the difference too here is like the Russians would take these principles and say, okay, let's max out our muscle snatch for a double. So there maybe you could argue would be going to max, but it's not like the load is going to be that intense. Okay, so now we're finally getting into some of the other stuff that I want to really discuss. And I know that like the history stuff is somewhat, I think it's important that we have a comprehension of all this just so that we can build upon it and make them better, really. Okay, so undulating periodization, Dietmar Schmidt-Bleicher was essentially the first guy to bring in variable reps and sets. And so meaning recognizing that if we're escaping the linear model, we can actually change what we're trying to do just based off of reps and sets. So if we want to, instead of doing in the first phase 3 sets of 10, what if we did 10 sets of 3? What if we did 7 sets of 2? What if we change these reps and sets around? And so a lot of the research still to this day is with Schmidt-Bleicher and a guy named Hartman. So a lot of the undulation work. And now even to the point where it's like daily undulating periodization. And I would argue a lot of what we do is based off of this, not entirely, but a lot of it. I just want to share, this was a recent link that goes into trained athletes respond best to undulating periodization in regards to strength gains. And this is the other thing. A lot of anti-periodization people, Joel Seedman said this on our podcast. I don't use a periodization model because all the research says that you don't need it. A couple of people have said this to me, like I don't use a periodization model because we don't need it. All of the research that shows that you don't need a periodization model is based off of athletes that are untrained. If you have trained athletes, there's always research with trained athletes that will show some model beats no model, and in most cases, an undulating model beats all models. So if you have trained athletes, you need to use a model. Now, my argument would be this is where we're going with everything that we're going to get into is we have to establish when do we start with a model when do we use one model and shift to another? And then what does that mean for trained athletes as well? And that's the big goal here, is that understanding all these different impacts from the history of periodization. Okay, so muscle size not impacted as much unless there's more of a devotion to hypertrophy. And then I would also bring this up. I think that it's the most dynamic for all sports. Even to the point, I was reading another paper last night that they were taking no training in season for athletes, for soccer players, versus one power day and one hypertrophy day. And the power and the hypertrophy day, the performance of those players was substantially higher. Even they were even increasing size during the season and maintaining their sprint speed and stuff like that, just by training twice a week after they had already been training 4 days a week. So it's a really dynamic system, and it's concurrent. So you can have concurrent days, meaning you have 1 day on size focus, 1 day on power focus, or it's within the session itself. You can also make it concurrent, meaning you want to focus on explosiveness and strength in the same session. So this is where a lot of my I would say Dr. B for sure had a huge impact. Poliquin had a huge impact. And Poliquin was a huge follower of undulating periodization. And then I would even argue it wasn't termed as much for undulation from Vorobyov, but I would argue a lot that he has a lot of the same principles. Okay, and so that gets into our system. So does anybody have any questions on this?
I just had a thought, like you mentioned this study said, okay, trained athletes have better adaptation.
That was over 2 years.
That was over 2 years.
2 years of training.
My question is, why wouldn't you look at trained athletes in a certain...
I think because of Trevor could actually...
It's harder to get research subjects that are
Yeah.
probably part of the reason.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Is like a lot of it comes back to is that like
availability.
who is funding it and where are they coming from? And if it's a government funded research paper, which a vast majority of research is government funded, then they have to pull from an audience of university students. And most of them are untrained.
So like back in the day, just bringing up the Bulgarian method, something like that was probably funded through like the actual state, was it?
It was fully state funded.
Fully state funded.
Yes.
Even if it was a terrible system, so that's why we know it today.
Yes. Yes. All of those were fully state funded. And I would even argue that's sort of been like the downfall of performance now. I mean, not that we're lacking in performance in the US, but like most of our knowledge of periodization literally stems from like this book, Strength Training Sport, has maybe 2 or 3, actually just ironically, undulating periodization studies here. So they have like one chapter of periodization of training, and it's like 9 pages long. So there's not a lot in Western literature on in-depth periodization. Most of it comes from Verkhoshansky, who was more Western, or who was Russian, has a Western influence, and then this book from R.A. Roman, who was a weightlifting coach, and he also worked with Dave Riegert. This is a yearly model, and even though it has Ilya on it, it's an older model. Like, it's literally like all the Russian manuals are really where we have our biggest interest, or our biggest feed of periodization is from the Russian manuals, not from Western papers. And they were all fully federally funded. They were all, the whole, Dr. B's entire system was based off of other coaches sending him what they thought, and then he pieced that into his own interpretation and created the Soviet throws model, essentially. So then when it collapsed, nobody else was doing this in the world. And the US model is like, bodybuilding was very traditionally linear based. That's sort of where we're going. And I do think, for me personally, I think in our system, I think it's probably the most undulating later once you get to like level 2, 3, 4. But there's a lot of linear even within the undulating model. Like there's in a session, you know, the hypertrophy points that we do, like if we're doing dumbbell bench, you might do a very traditional linear model that we're following with the hypertrophy work. But the strength work and the other work around that line might follow more undulating. And I think that's where there's a lot of confusion and nuance. Okay, so any questions on that? I know, like.
I mean, it makes sense now because, like, how come every like high school football locker room does the same thing?
Yeah.
It's super linear because of that. Just 'cause
I also think it's easy.
it's
Okay,
easy.
for 4 weeks we're gonna do 10 reps.
Yeah.
For 4 weeks we're gonna do 6, and then for 4 weeks we're gonna do 3, and then we're gonna go back to the beginning. And we're gonna test at the end, and then go back to the beginning and just redo that again. And they're untrained, most kids are untrained, so it will work.
It will work.
Yeah. So there's just some model that they have to follow. And this is the argument Dr. B would always say is like, the model can, everybody's model can work, but it also has to advance with the athlete.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we've struggled in the US is that we've never created a advancing model because I think there's a model of like, we don't need a model. Then they ring a bell, they ring that bell, and then now they need linear, and then they ring this bell, and then now they need more undulating, and then they ring this bell, and now all of a sudden they're in this crazy dynamic system that we have. That's sort of how I envisioned it. So that takes us into our system, parabolic system, multiple systems under one, okay? Level 1, the volume is altered, so it's a form of the complex method. There's a lot of volume. And it's meaning, in this case, using Loveland, right? Volume, high volume, it's an altered form of the complex method. She comes in, she snatches, she cleans, she squats. She snatches, she cleans, she front squats. She snatches, she cleans, she benches. She snatches, she cleans, she does jumps. Basically it, that's like her program. So that's level 1, okay? She gets reps done consistently on same movements until the next level is open. Now, and this goes back to what we discussed last week with exercise identification. This is where we need to identify what level 1 exercises are available, okay? So we are going to be determining that. I forgot to pinpoint, who's taking the best notes right now, Weeks or Taman?
Yeah,
Well, you haven't been typing anything. I see Weeks writing, and I see Taman has one page. Hang on though. I've noticed that his pages, sometimes those are notes from the previous week.
This is the new week.
He said, who's got the best notes?
How many is?
You didn't even think about this, man.
Yeah.
I'm
He's
not
got a
even in
computer.
thought.
He's official.
I'm not even in thought.
How many notes does Legend have on there?
What do you mean?
I got 2 pages.
Okay, then it's on Big L. He's gonna fill this in.
This is today.
Oh, he's got a lot. He's got like 2 pages of notes.
Okay, Legend's got the notes. Yeah, Weeks is like drawing a. What are you drawing?
A lot of this stuff, like, I do. So,
Yeah.
I mean, like, what am I gonna expand on?
I think outside of this is I wanted to provide a historical background just because and maybe it's just because that was what I just like that shit.
No, I think it is important. One, because we understand like where things come from and how things play out, but also two, as a marketing side.
Yeah,
it could
fair.
Be like, this is the first American periodization model.
Yeah,
Something crazy like that.
yeah.
I don't know if that's true.
I think
We're
too.
also not just pulling this out of thin air.
Yeah. And that's the other thing is like, I want you guys to know too, for me, is like, we followed in high school like a linear model, and then when I was a senior, Paul Ferenczi gave me Werner Gunther's cassette, the VHS cassette, and he goes, watch this. And it had the 92 Olympics, it had the 87 World Championships on it, and it had Werner Gunther's training video, okay? My parents still have it, because they're cleaning out their whole house, and they found all my VHS cassettes. So, in his training thing, which I didn't, Jefta actually trains where he does his stair jumps. He trains in that place. So I said we should go over and do a video there.
Serious.
Yeah. So, big G's over there. So in his video, he actually has a pyramid, okay? Not an Amway pyramid, but like an actual pyramid. It says like general preparation. Now, this was in French. We had a French teacher interpret the whole thing for us. It goes like, if I remember correctly, it's like general preparation, then it's extensive, intensive, and then peak. And they go through what the general prep movements are for strength exercises and for throwing. Then what are the extensive, the next level, essentially sort of like relating this to Dr. B's. And I think that stuff early on sparked me to think like, okay, how can we organize this? Now, this takes us to this point. I think what you're saying, Legend, is actually relatable, and even saying like, look, all of this stuff is based around all of these different influences. So high volume from the complex method. Over time, this will have hints of linear being contributing to it, okay? So level 1 of our system is high volume with some hints of linear periodization. Goal, and this would be for Trevor and for you guys too, would be like, okay, a level 1 kid comes in, what are the exercises available in our periodization model for technical coordination, for absolute strength, for hypertrophy work, for speed work? You know, like should a kid who's coming in to learn how to do speed with Legend in the developmental class, should they be running, 5 sets of 80-meter sprints all out, or should they be learning mechanics? So that would be level 1 where we identify those things. Then level 2 would be, this is sort of where we get a little bit more of an undulating program week by week with specific block incentives. I sort of think about like in a specific program. I mean, you guys will even have this where actually like clusters. Maybe you have clusters 1 week, and then 5x3 the next week, then clusters and 5x3, or you go clusters 5x3, 5x3 clusters. So it's like an undulating system in that regard, week to week or bi-weekly. You follow me on that? I'm thinking about the high school kids, even the high school football guys that I'll have. Let me finish this, and then Trevor, I'll take your question. For like George right now, his first 2 days of the week, he's lifting actually pretty heavy for just coming off a season, like sets of 5. His last 2 days of the week, he's doing super crazy hypertrophy work. So it's sort of undulating in the week for him. So it's like push the weight on specific lifts or specific rep schemes to contribute to a specific adaptation. Trevor.
I guess, so, two questions. One, does the undulating only happen week by week or in another?
I think it can also happen period by period too, like 4 weeks by 4 weeks. Yeah.
And then,
But I think it could also be 8 weeks, 8 weeks.
like part of how we do it, I feel like it kind of almost, the
Builds up.
intensity keeps building each block, and then it resets.
Yeah.
And it's almost like undulating like 2 to 3 times per year on like the that's almost like the macro basis, but then on like the micro basis,
It can be up and down, yeah.
week, and the meso basis, I feel like it's more linear for us almost.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you're seeing it different.
So I think that's, this is where I think it's like, what's a beginner periodization model? And that would be sort of like just the reps with a linear basis, but mainly just get tons of reps with a minimal pool of exercises. So that would be level 1. I think level 2 is where most of our population on site and in peak strength lives. And that's where I think it's this to what you just laid out, where you're like, okay, you slowly build up intensity over time, and then you drop back down to high volume. And then you slowly build up intensity over time, and it's like undulating week to week or meso to meso with a linear buildup. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I think to think about it, most of our population is that person, is a level 2.
Okay.
Now, a level 3 and a level 4 would be different.
Okay.
So the other thing would be level 2, now they're opening up, we can select more exercises for them to use.
Yeah. So my second question would be on like the week to week undulation. What do you see undulating? Like it seems like sometimes there's like a slight variation of intensity. Sometimes it's more just like variation, just different rep speeds with the same ultimate volume.
They've got right now like 1 week, maybe it's like 3 doubles or 4 doubles on like a power snatch, and we're measuring their VBT. Then the next week, it's go heavy. So to me, we're undulating between a speed and heavy, and speed and heavy.
Now,
And then we're gonna,
like a level 4.
yes.
Not like a level 2.
So a level 2, a level 2 would be, okay, so a level 2 in that regard would be on a week by week, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, so on a week by week basis, I would use George's example because he would be a level 2, and it'd be, 2 heavier days, 2 high volume days, 2 heavier days, 2 high volume days.
Like
Interweekly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, and then over time, that might be his volume decreases a little bit on like day 3, and he just does more of a traditional athlete day. So over time, let's say over 16 weeks, that volume might come down here, and then the intensity goes up there.
Okay.
I see it more week to week though. Because the other thing I think with that is like
you would like to implement that more on a week to week basis.
yes, especially based off of
even for level 2.
yes.
Like having like one a little lower volume, one a little.
Yeah, and I want to share with Weeks' example of him specifically. I think that it makes the athlete dial in their training in the weight room more. Like, so he would get, he was talking 8 or 10 doubles at 190 or your back squat. So 190 for 8 doubles was what he was building towards. And like, this was over like 8 weeks, basically, like 2 programs leading into that 4th week of the last program, essentially. But then it's like the other weeks he can use to build into this goal. I want to hit 190 for this. And I think when you lay that out, it helps the athlete have that vision or that goal of what they want to work towards. And I even think that we can do that with a VBT. Now, this would be level 3 and 4. I wouldn't do this with a high school kid. Would be like, okay, I want the speed here and I want the weight here. So this week, I want on this day, your weight is the focus, and then on day 3, the speed is the focus.
No. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, the way that I know it from undulating is like, all right, let's say like day 1, super heavy, like we're slamming weight. Day 2 could be like moderate. Day 3 could be like a little bit lighter. So like when you're thinking of like football, especially in season, it's like we're starting high, and then we're making sure that by
So that's like intra-weekly. So
Yeah.
it's going like this,
by the end
up
of the
this.
week,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's game time, they're not dead.
Yeah.
And, you do that each week.
Now, what is high, what is low in that case?
So
Is
like-
it volume and intensity gets lower, or is
You
it,
can change that.
or does the intensity go up, volume just goes down?
It depends.
Now, I would say for most high school football players, it would be like, let's say they do 3 sets of 3 cleans, then they do 5 sets of 5 back squats, then they do 3 or 2 sets of hypertrophy on a Saturday after they lift. But then by the time they lift on Tuesday, they might do 2 sets of everything, and they're just going in to do
At
some
lighter
simples.
weight.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
One more question. Lots of times in your programs you do weeks 1 and 4 and 2 and 3.
Yeah.
Um,
Because I like to think about weeks 2 and 3 are like, how does this impact 4? And you use week 1 as the baseline. Week 1's the baseline, week 4 is the test, move to the next.
So essentially there can be, on a kind of micro meso scale, there can be, you can undulate intra-weekly,
Yeah.
or essentially every week's like its own little micro.
You can even do it with,
undulating
like,
system.
they're
You can do it
doing,
1 week where it's alternating, then you can do 2 weeks where
Yeah.
you know.
and then it comes down exercises too. Hey, this week we're gonna flat bench, next week we're gonna do incline, next week we're flat benching, next week we're inclining. The thing to also think about is like how it plays out over a long period of time. So there might be a program that you have 1 and 2 are the same, week 1 and 2 are the same, and then week 3 and 4 are the same. But week 3 and 4 of the previous program, we're setting you up for week 3 and 4 of the following program. So that's how I like to think about piecing it all together. The problem I have is I'm not clear with them on what I'm doing when I'm thinking that way and I'm laying it out, and then I get, why are we doing this? This is stupid. But I want to see on the incline, what does your incline do to your bench on week 4?
All right, this is my thoughts. Pretty much all of this is macro cycled. It's a big macro cycles, 4, 5, parabolic system that it's block programming that's linear at times and just undulates throughout all of it.
Once you get more advanced.
So it's a block system that's linear until you get more advanced.
Yeah,
That's it.
yeah.
And then it undulates
My only thing though with the block system is I think that
with athlete,
with some of our,
non-traditional with the sports.
with the
that aren't-
sports,
that don't have peak dates.
I think for us with the sports, but with the block, like in my opinion, block is like you got 1, maybe 2 things that you're focusing on. I think we're focusing on make them explosive, get them stronger, and ideally they can.
Yeah, it's not like you're doing block principles, but you have the block time frame.
Yes, yes, yes.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So it's sort of a mold of all of them. Then you got the impact of Dr. B's exercise selection to a point, and then you got the variations from Vorobyov to a point as well, and piecing it all into one while assessing everybody.
That seems simple.
This is like a transformer.
It's not simple, but it like, well, duh, you should do this. Like,
Yeah, but this is not what people do, dude.
these idiots were just doing weightlifting movements back in the day and like, let's see if they can throw a football far. Like, that's dumb. That makes no sense.
Okay, so
Like now you're I don't cut you off again, sorry.
Yeah,
All
no.
you're doing is just like, you're just advancing the level of the athlete. Like, okay, if you hit better benchmarks or you're a better sport athlete, you get to do cooler stuff. That's it.
yeah, because then also the peak becomes more important for that athlete. How the
Not-
preparation is getting into a season becomes more important, more valuable.
But the peak aspect is only like, it only involves so many sports.
Yeah. Yeah, but
Now,
also
like, every
peaking,
other sport has a peak, but it's just like,
they
it's
have to
just
be in
not
good
undulating.
shape getting into a season. The peak is really when they start the season, and then we got to maintain it for the season itself.
yeah.
And that's where I actually think this comes into play, is that we get athletes in really good shape going into a season, and then they can stay at a moderate level. Actually, I think Logan's a good example. Is like, he's still pretty strong at the end of a long football season. Now, his shoulder hurts a little bit, but like, dude, strength levels haven't, like, he's not that much weaker than he had. It probably would take him 4 weeks of hard training to get back to like big lifts.
Yeah.
And I think that's the advantage. It's like we get somebody in shape quicker and better in more characteristics, and then we can maintain that easier. Dude, thinking about Maddox, like this dude's hang power clean in 130, like back squatting 190 or whatever it was, like 195 for a double in high school. You know how easy it can be to be like, yo, yeah, and I don't know what Sam's gonna do, but he can just say, hey, for the next 2 weeks, at the end of February, let's say he throws 50 plus, he makes indoor states. For 2 weeks, we're gonna back off and do like speed work. And now all of a sudden it's so easy to make him line up for a decent peak at indoor states because of this. Instead of just being like, well, we're just going to focus on one characteristic at this time, and we're going to start with 3 sets of 10, then advance to 3 sets of 6, then advance to 3 sets of 3. Do you follow me on that?
I get it. I think it's just funny. Like again, I think it goes back to this team's lazy. Lazy in the sense of like.
Ours or what?
It's lazy, yeah, but it's
Because
also
like we're just gonna do the same thing over and over and over again, and then hope for a different result. Like.
Well, yeah.
It's insanity.
also like super close-minded, like you said. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Insanity.
like, I'm
Is
Russian.
some of this the
I'm
difference
against
between,
the
like, I mean, like one group training program versus like individualizing?
Yeah.
And I think even, I was even wondering with this, would you see like level 1 and level 2 being a little bit more like everyone's kind of doing the same thing, and once you get to level 3, it starts to get more.
I don't know,
individualized?
because I was even thinking about level 2 when Nick was here. And like, the difference
Yeah,
I
when
would
Nick was even a junior in high school,
he was level 3.
probably wasn't a level 2.
Yeah, but he would do almost the same workout as the level 2 guys.
Yeah, okay.
Now, the jumps would be a little different. He would do different.
Program
Huh? Like, so I think, well, let me go into 3 and 4 here. So it'd be like, this is where it's much more undulating with hints from Vorobyov with the exercise in there. In season, the lifts are going to be more hypertrophy based and impulse based, meaning like moving weight fast. I think that's where we can develop more of the VBT stuff. And then during the week, there's undulation from day to day depending on the main goal. Is it speed, strength, or explosiveness? So level 3 and 4, I think, gets really, really into the undulation, but I think it's like, think about it through the lever. Like, we assess this athlete, they're a level 1, they get basic stuff, they get basic exercise, they get basic rep schemes. And that's really what I want to go into shortly is like, we need to identify and recognize that levels get certain types of exercises, levels get certain types of reps and set schemes, and the only way they get to unlock those is to get to the next level from doing work, from doing reps. So it's like exercises get determined per phase, per level. And this also goes in then to the blocks that we use in periodization is like during this block, you're only really choosing from these exercises at this level. So exposure phase exercises, level 2, we would be able to determine what they are based off of the technical coordination, absolute strength, jumps, whatever it is. So rep schemes are determined per phase, per level. Tempos are determined per phase, per level. Intensity and volume is determined per phase, per level based on the volume multiplier. Do you remember this, Taman?
No.
That's where we're taking like hypertrophy and applying like 0.5 to the reps for managing, and this is from like 3 or 4 sessions ago where we went over this. I can bring it up on the. That's where I want to go back in the coming weeks. So we got more to do today. Is going back to sport depth and back to the volume multiplier. Anyway, that was from that phasic volume presentation. Okay. Intensity, volume get changed, and then speed gets determined per phase, per level. That's one thing I'm going to ask Derek Hansen. How do you assess someone with speed, and then how do you program and periodize someone who's a 16-year-old with their speed? Okay, now, the undulating, so this is where we can get into a little bit more here. The basis of the system is that the exercise selection is based on the period of adaptation needed. I think that's pretty easy. You guys need to get stronger, so you need to clean heavier, or you need to get stronger, you need to back squat heavier. A higher volume can be more variation movements while having a foundational standard exercise. Alter between heavy loads and the velocity load, and it can be, this would sort of be based off of what you were asking, Trevor, is like weekly or monthly or bi-monthly undulation. And then the minimal strict rules, so it's like knowing the athlete type, understanding the sport depth and the benchmarks needed, because this is going to create the level. So the sport depth and the benchmark creates the level of the athlete. And then we understand the time of year, and then we specify the clear adaptations needed. So in my vision, it's like sport depth level, let's just make it simple. Sport depth 1, shot putters, okay? During the fall time of year, we need to increase max strength while maintaining explosiveness. Okay, so what does that mean? Max strength correlated to back squat. Explosiveness correlated to clean snatch jumps. Okay, so we need to make sure we have this many reps and sets of clean snatch jumps. We need to make sure that we have this much tension from back squat or front squat to make sure that we can get really, really strong in the fall. So the goal would then be in the year, we can designate periods, put adaptations to those periods, and then look at the level of the athlete and say, okay, based off of this level of the athlete, you guys are level 4. These are the types of reps and sets that we can use. These are the types of exercises that we can use during these times of year. And then the dynamic usage is that we have athletes that come in here, like everybody's like a big GPP. And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying we have people come in here who never train and they can literally just come right in and start to see success from the system right away. Pathways can be established uniquely based off period of year and an even easier in-season component. This is what I was just talking about with Logan. And then in-season training can be altered simply off strength of schedule. So this is where you have a team sport, so you can change these things quickly. And this is my goal too for this stuff, is that we would get to the point eventually, at some point, where we can talk to football coaches that we're working with and be like, dude, this is how you got to set up your schedule of training. Actually, full disclosure on this is I set up South Dakota State's schedule of training so that this week they were wrestling Northern Iowa, who's pretty good in wrestling. They're like a top 15, but not as good as South Dakota State. So we still lifted heavy on Monday, and then they lost by a point in a dual meet. And it's like, we thought that they were going to be able to go through this week. And that's where it's like, yo, we got to be aware of that. Like, now, that's on feedback from the coaching staff saying, like, we can still lift heavy on this week. They're tough, but we should be able to beat them. And that's where it's like, yo, sometimes, also, does it really matter that they lost a dual meet in November? No, so they can take that risk a little bit more because the priority is really later on in the season when they get into the Big 12 competition. It'll impact their ranking, but not anything else. What were you gonna say?
Can't be losing, bro.
Yeah, you can't, yeah. And then specific individual periodization. This is where I do think it's easier too to say, like, if you have a team setting, it's easier to say, okay, the level 1 guys are doing this exercise. Let's say they're doing a full clean. The level 2 guys are doing a power clean, full clean, and the level 3 guys like Nick is gonna do a high hang clean. Like, you can make quick adaptations to a program that a whole team is getting, but to specify, I actually think about this with the younger Henny. Think about that. She's doing cleans or snatches or squatting, you know, where her sister might do 1-box power cleans or something. It's changing slightly just based off of her ability and her age and her level.
Now, just based off that, don't you have to change rep schemes too?
Yeah.
Now you got 3 different programs going at one time.
Yeah, but it's not hard because you know what's going on.
I get that.
And you're familiar with the athletes, and you've got to be in comprehend where the athlete's at.
I feel like that's something we do naturally.
Yes, it's a flow.
I know.
Like, obviously, like, I can say, like, to Matt, yo, you got this. But if I look at John, it's like, yo, you got meat and potatoes. We need to know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Like, it's not that challenging. No, it's like maybe we'll keep advancing this further. So I think I want to go through these, and then I want to finish up with a discussion on what now. I honestly I think what I'll do here. Think through, okay, exposure phase. Again, you know, I just want to cover this higher volume. Comprehension phase, higher volume. Ascension phase to me is like the transition phase. And I think this is also probably the most important phase that then leads into a higher intensity summit phase. And then either the back off phase of realization or more high intensity with a little bit of volume depending upon the athlete there. But I sort of see the ascension phase, the transition, almost like that keystone point. And this is where with the reps and sets and with the exercises, I want to clarify what exercises, and this is mainly, Trevor, what I think we really need to work towards. First, really clarifying sport depth benchmark lifts per level. So what's depth 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, level 1, 2, 3, 4, benchmark lifts. And then say, okay, exposure phase, sport depth 2, level 1 only gets these exercises. And only gets these rep schemes. So that way we don't have someone who's think about you have a level 1 kid come in and you got them squatting with chains. Yeah. And then that's where this comes into play, okay? And this is where I want to build this out a lot, is exposure phase. They're basically snatching, cleaning, standard jumps or hops. Strength exercises.
All levels?
Well, this would be like level 1. They're just learning how to this would be like essentially level 1, level 2.
Now, why does that, like, level 1 across all sport depths?
Well,
are
this
they
is
not the same?
if
So this seems like it needs to be.
this needs to be
like
fleshed out
10
further.
times more in depth than what you have here. This is just
Correct.
kind of like a general overview.
Yes, 100%. To me, this would be like sport depth 1, 2, maybe 3.
Okay.
Sport depth 4, they're just cleaning. They're just doing jumps. They're just single leg squatting. Sport depth 1, they're just snatching. They're cleaning. They're doing jumps. They're doing back squat. They're doing front squat. They're more strength based. Sport depth 2, same thing. But sport depth 4, 5, they're just learning how to do cleans and they're doing goblet squats.
But why?
Because they don't need as much resistance work.
You're level 1. You're a basic athlete.
Yeah, they're just learning how to move a bar.
Why can't they do all that stuff then?
I mean, they can theoretically, but they might only be coming in twice a week.
You're level 1. You need to come in 4 days a week.
That's if you're getting them to come in 4 days a week. Let me go through this. So strength exercises would be single leg squat, front squat, back squat, bench press. Speed exercises, simple drills from Big Ledge, which he needs to give me 5 drills. So I got to make an Instagram video with him later today. Easy build-ins, resisted work with lower volume. High rep waves, this is where we need to clarify. They're not doing waves if they're a level 1 or a level 2. They're doing waves if they're a level 3 or 4. I mean, you guys might have them do waves in the back, but it might not be the best. And then static work is where I see this coming in. And static work is mainly from Vorobyov. You know, pre-fatigue is more advanced. But sometimes younger kids, level 1, they might actually benefit from some pre-fatigue because they actually learn how to feel their body. Comprehension phase is when we can add in more variations. Squatting variations here. First level of the variations of squats. So like just a simple pause. Switching exercises, higher speed work, and this is what I want to talk with Legend about and Derek Hansen, see what he says about like Charlie Francis and what Ben Johnson was doing. And then now this would be more advanced if they're using myo reps, slower eccentric. Contrast methods I think level 2 can use.
We contrast level 1 kids.
Yeah, I think that's fine. What's your issue, Tamam?
I feel like this is like it boxes a lot of things. Like, why can't I just give a kid?
It's a guideline, and it's not like
okay.
set in stone
I
that if
know,
you don't
I see
follow this, it's not like I would recommend following it and being like, look, but you got 20 kids in the back, and you got that kid that was wearing the red shirt the one day, and you're like, dude, this kid can barely move. Then you have him go goblet squat, and then he immediately goes into like squat and jumps on a box. And then he rests for a minute and a half, and you gotta throw as much stuff at him to get him to have any type of coordination, then you gotta do that. Think about, I'm giving you the book, and then you're hung up on what's up in this box up here that has like special cases.
I mean, I'm just trying to like put it all together. Like, I'm trying to like, I think the only thing that throws me off the most is like when you say you have each phase, then you have the levels.
Yeah.
Right? And then you're like, the sport depths can only use, based off the sport depths, these levels of athletes can only use these exercises during these phases. I'm like, man, it's too much shit to think about.
With those rep schemes.
What's the point of having, why,
Yes, that's what my
I'm
argument
trying
is.
to put these motherfuckers on an autobahn and we rolling. I'm not making no exits.
what's the overarching strategy of exercise variation
Yeah, I know.
through
It's just,
the phases?
Exercise variation through the phases.
Like why, like exercise selection, like.
So Trevor's asking, okay, you're asking me,
I feel like you're giving specific examples. I want to know the why of like.
why should, okay, so why would I not change exercise, or why do I limit exercise choice?
Right.
I limit exercise choice because someone who's younger or is a lower level should have more time.
No, but I mean through the phases. I
Through-
understand from the levels, but I mean through like exposure, comprehension, and
Okay,
assessment, summit.
range of motion. Remember back to the progressive overload. What are the variables? Tempo, speed, distance. If we change the distance, now if we alter the range of motion for an individual, they might have less tension theoretically, and then in turn they recover quicker and they perform better at their event.
So what does that look like then? So you would have more
So
range
let's
of
say,
motion in
let's say we're in, let's pretend that we're in comprehension phase and it's May of a track season and they peak in August. Let's do 8 weeks of force development work. Okay, what does that mean? All right, well, we're gonna go partial lifts off of a box, power, measuring VBT work. Then we're gonna do partial squats where we do super heavy to increase rate of force development with a drop set that's full range of motion, but most of their work's partial. So that would then lead into, what was the question?
So like how does that change then to summit phase?
So then that would lead into, maybe instead of doing 6 total sets there, they do 3 sets or 4 sets of that, but they don't do the drop set with a full range of motion squat.
With exercise. So they would do a partial range of motion squat?
Yeah, level 3, level 4 guys, yeah.
I think that, yeah, I'm just trying to get to like what's the overarching
That's where I think the importance,
like the overarching exercise selection change from like throughout like exposure, comprehension, ascension, summit.
I see simple full range of motion movements, exposure, comprehension.
Okay.
Traditional foundational exercises. Now this is talking level 2, 3, 4. Level 1, they just do the simple stuff over and over again. Then ascension phase and summit phase, they might do more partial movements, one day really heavy, one day faster. That's where we think back to the progressive overload principles and what are those variables and why do those variables change?
Okay, that makes sense.
Because then you're looking at like, okay, now I can tie a specific speed. Like, think about it this way. For VBT, you can tie peak velocity below 0.4, okay? Or mean velocity, average velocity below 0.4. We know they're gonna be going really heavy. Every rep, They're doing 10 singles and every rep better be below 0.4. Okay, well then they're going 10 singles at like 95%. But that same variable can be altered by saying, okay, I want 10 singles at 2.3 meters per second. Well, now they're doing lighter and they're moving. And if we think through that progressive overload page that we looked at earlier, that plays a huge role in how the exercises are selected from period to period. It's just clarifying what those variable changes can do to the body, which lead to the adaptation that we're looking for. Come on.
It almost seems like with exercise selection, it's like with that model, it's like reverse progressive. It's like progressive underload.
Well, no, because you're overload. I mean, in that case that
You're overloading with speed. You're overloading with.
I mean, you could still do those 10 singles like 5 weeks out from a peak.
Okay.
Yeah, you could still do it. No, what I would say is like and this goes to what Weeks was talking about earlier. It's like maybe on day 1, Weeks comes back and he has to do his 8 doubles, maybe not a cluster style, but he has to just do 8 doubles. So let's say later on in the year we do those 8 doubles on a Sunday, but on Wednesday he has to make sure that he power cleans 140 kilos at 1.65 meters per second. Now we're looking at each variable on different days. So we're making sure that this heavy thing is not interrupting this speed movement here.
Okay. Gotcha.
That's how I see that being.
Yeah.
And that could even be, I would even argue, could be something that we would do with the partial range of motion. And my goal too is that with us doing all the stuff with the VBT work, is that we can then also just find the percentages for most people to teach them, like, hey, you don't have to have a machine to do this. You can just do these percentages with this intent. Or we have some integration with VBT into our app, which would be sick, long term.
Good thing.
Yeah, long term. So, I think this part right here is the biggest discussion in space to really expand upon. Is what exercises are determined. This is what you just said, Trevor. What exercises are determined per phase, per level, and why? And then what rep schemes are determined per phase, per level, and then what tempos, what intensity, volume, what speed stuff. All of that, that's the most important part around this, and then that factors into the multi-system parabolic periodization. And this is where it's like, this is the system. I've always said it's undulating. I think it is undulating, but I also think there's some block, there's some classic Russian, there's some linear. It's like, how do we differentiate that moving forward, or is it necessary? Transformer programming.
Take all of them, put
Yeah.
it into one.
Okay, does anybody have any questions about this? I think really I need to, before we have another one on periodization, I need to expand this, and this is going to be really what we go off of. Can you write that down? Dane's going to answer the goals on parabolic system page. But now what I want to do next week is go back into the sport depths and really try and dial in the levels of the sport depths. And it's from a basic generic stance. Because for the book, I don't want to get into any sports in the sport depth. I just want to tie sports to the sport depths, tie benchmarks to the levels.
I also don't think it has to be like laying the entire thing out like 5 times. It can be like, what are the differences with this sport depth? What are the differences like with this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
And but I think identifying the sports within the sport depth.
Yeah. We have that.
Yeah, these sports and these sport depths, this is why the exercises, rep scheme, tempo, speed, intensity, volume are all different amongst these.
Yeah.
And that's it.
And before we close out, I wanted to bring up with the sport depth, because I was thinking about this going to bed last night, because I worked through this and I was reading through some of the periodization books, and I'm going, I think the basis of our system is literally the sport depth model. Like, that is the entire basis, and I have that in the book. I'm putting that at the end of section 1, and I actually think it should probably be the first thing that we talk about, is like, this is something you've never been exposed to, and this is what it means, and you have to know this to progress forward with the tools. And like what Weeks was saying, where it's like, we do this naturally. The goal is that this happens naturally in your brain, because we're gonna be working through all this stuff so much that you're gonna be like, all right, this kid's at this point in the phase in this year, this is the exercises, these are the rep schemes. He doesn't need to do the 1-6 method when he's a 10th grader. That's coming to you guys in 5 weeks, 4 weeks. 1-6. Any questions? Weeks?
No, I mean, I get it. As I was thinking about it, just like as we were talking, like level 1, none of this stuff really pertains to them. Level 2, level 3, level 4, that's where you can, add different variables and a lot of manipulation. I get it.
I think, yo, he's so much smarter than you.
Well, I have my annual plan stuff.
Dude,
like that.
that's the thing. And his plan, that is like really clear. I'll bring this up, Mosatara last year presented an annual plan, and I'm like looking at it like, this is so like crazy confusing, whereas his is nice to follow. And that's what we're gonna have, that version. And I'll say this, Trevor, related to peak strength. I think level 1s is where the importance of technique comes in. It's like everything technique has to be based around this. And Medvedyev talks about that, like the first 2 years of training is all foundational lifts, and you have to dial in your technique for a clean, for a snatch, for a squat, for a front squat, for a lunge, for everything. And that's where it's like the level 1s that we get, we've gotta be on it, like even to the point of like dumbbell benches, like everything, that we're just hammering them on technique, so that when we get, and I think we do a really good job with this, so that when we get to level 2, 3, we're barely even thinking about it. Like, dude, I'll use Maddox. Like, Maddox's technique, he's not like a technical wizard, but he's proficient. And that's all we need for sports performance, is that we need athletes to be proficient with their squat, with their clean, with their snatch, with their front squat, with their benches. Like, watch Nick clean. Like, his clean technique's solid. He's not bad. His snatch technique's even not that bad. So then it's like setting the priority of what the variables that we change. We set that priority entering into the phases and by recognizing levels. Okay, anybody else have any questions? Okay, Legends gotta close it out.
To what